Welcome, and thank you for joining me for this video in our TMS video series for instructors. In this video, we'll be looking at things that you can check when a student doesn't see a launch button on their class activities. There can be several different reasons for why a student isn't seeing their launch buttons. If your entire class is not seeing the launch buttons, then you should check first to make sure that the class start time has already been reached. So if it is January 24th or even January 25th at 7:30 or 7:59, none of the students are going to have access to the labs until 8 a.m. on the start day of the class, or whatever time the class is scheduled for on the start day of the class. That will prevent them from seeing their lab activity launch buttons. Another thing that will affect whether or not your students see launch buttons on their labs is the status of the class. If you come down here to the status section, you'll see this class is tentative. Labs are only available once a class is started, and that class must be in a status of scheduled or guaranteed to run. Those are the only two statuses that will show launch buttons on the labs to your students. Another thing that you can check on, which hardly ever happens, but it is a possibility, if you go to the roster and you add a column on your roster for labs. If the labs are not enabled, the checkbox will be unchecked. Before a class is started, an operations manager can come in and enable the labs. After a class is started, you will need to contact support. Our help desk will be able to re-enable those labs for you. Okay, I've enabled the labs. I've set the class to be scheduled, and it has already started. Now, if a student still isn't seeing their launch buttons, there are a couple of things you can check on their class enrollment. When a student first logs into class, they're dropped on their current training page. When they go to click on the name of the class, it'll open up to their enrollment. And the first thing that you should check, and this is very common, is that the enrollment status must be a status of enrolled. If they are not in a status of enrolled, they will not be able to launch labs. So this needs to be updated for the student, and your operations manager can do that. And at this point, I have updated the enrollment status to enrolled. But my student, if I come down here, still isn't seeing any launch buttons, even though the class has started, it's at a scheduled status, the labs are enabled, and they are enrolled. This is because they must agree to the end user license agreement. It can disable any activities within a class, including the ability to launch a virtual classroom until it has been agreed to. To agree to a end-user license agreement, the user must be logged in as themselves. They can open the agreement and agree to it. And after that is done, you can see that it's been agreed to. I will now have my launch buttons for all of my activities and my labs. So those are the items that you can check. The class status must be scheduled or guaranteed to run. The class has to have started. The labs must be enabled. You can check that on the roster. A student must be in the enrolled status, and the end user license agreement must be agreed to. Thank you for joining me for this video on what you need to check if a student doesn't see their launch buttons for their class activities.